Welcome, 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 everyone. Very nice to be back for the final current events class of the year. And if I can get my screen share to work, then we can get started right away. So, perhaps as you know, in today's class, I am going to be trying to guess with my crystal ball what is going to happen next year. Now, by its very nature, any of these predictions are going to probably be largely misguided. They're at least not perfect. So please don't hold me to too high of an account, but I will do my best based on my best understanding and based on my reading of The Economist, what maybe will happen. And we'll also, as part of this, be doing a review on what happened this year to try and make predictions about the next. So we've got four broad topic areas, and I've got Q&As for you that I really want you to answer as well. So if you're new to this class, I know some people are watching on YouTube, they won't be able to get involved, but that's okay. I would love you to answer the questions. It would be fantastic if you did. So let's get straight into it. We've got too much material to get through, as always. Let's launch straight in. We are going to first talk about geopolitics. As this implies, geopolitics is the politics of the interaction between nations around the world. And if we think about the history of geopolitics, we have some pretty clear trends, especially since World War II. And I think, as with the study of history, you have sort of continuity and disjunction. I think we're in for a period of quite significant disjunction, a break from continuity. So from 1945 to 1991, this is just after the fall of the end of World War II to the fall of the Soviet Union, roughly speaking, you have what we call bipolarity. This means that there are two main poles or sources of power in the world. You have, which is part of the Cold War conflict, where you have the US on one side and the US rules-based order, and you have the USSR on the other side. From 1991 to 2025, you end up with a period of unipolarity. So the Soviet Union collapses, all these different states form out of that. Russia's relatively weak, and you end up with a very, very dominant United States. They basically win the Cold War and they come out on top. They have massive economic power, and just like geopolitically, no one can even touch them, not even close. Their military is like outrageous. Their capacity to do whatever they want in the whole world is insane. So what stems from that is an America who is quite engaged in the rest of the world, an America who tries to prop up their European allies, who involves itself in the world, in various parts of the world, really directly, including like many wars in the Middle East, and just generally being like a presence for the world. People would call them the world police sometimes. This encompassed also the spread of the liberal international world order. So when we talk about liberalism, we're talking about things like democracy, sort of proliferation of democratic ideals and principles of a liberal democratic society, like free speech and free association, free religion, freedom of religion, all of these sorts of basic things. And this is all underpinned by US hegemony. So they will protect their allies, they'll protect democracies around the world, they'll create democracies out of non-democracies when they can, and they'll try and fail to do it in some places. And this is sort of the 1991, broadly speaking, to 2025 world order. Now we have to ask ourselves, what is coming next? What are we kind of beginning? Well, I think that a new world order is rapidly taking shape, and the main reason behind it is to do with Trump's second term in office, and his approach to the world as a result of that. So there has been a remarkable withdrawal from the international system. Institutions that were built by the US and were like essentially used to forward the US's soft power objectives all around the world are gone, or they're being quickly undermined. So there was the doging of USAID and foreign humanitarian aid. These are two really significant things. So when we say doging, I'm sure you remember the Department of Governmental, gosh, what is the E in that? Someone can tell me in the chat, I should know. But either way, you have the destruction of so many systems, and just like the removal of money that was considered waste. So the idea of Doge was to try to take away waste in the government. It's been quietly dismantled since then, but this feeling of trying to get rid of a bloated bureaucracy definitely continues. Um, so they gutted USAID, which was giving a lot of money all around the world to various different types of support. And the list of things, some of them seem kind of funny, some of them seem kind of serious. All the money's gone. There have been attacks and funding cuts to the UN as well. The UN is like the mainstay of the international world order. Yeah, Department of Government Efficiency, of course. Thanks, Hardy, in the chat. And there have been sanctions against the ICC, the International Criminal Court, because of their basically assigning warrants for Israeli leaders because of their actions in Gaza. Trump basically supports Israel to a degree. We'll talk about that in a bit more nuance later. But there have been attacks on like high up people in the International Criminal Court, sanctions put on them so they can't spend money or be in the US, which really stifles and stymies their capacity to achieve their goals. You have increased trade barriers and tariffs. So, of course, you're aware of Trump's Liberation Day tariffs. Now, they haven't amounted to as large as they were initially suspected, and they think that the average tariff rate right now is probably around 10%, all things considered. But that definitely has stopped a degree of international trade, which was holding the world together to an extent. You have increased transactionalism, and this is particularly with regard to traditional US allies in Europe and Asia. So Trump is willing to try to get trade deals, which isn't an intrinsically bad thing, but perhaps it's done in a way that reflects some sort of transactionalism directed towards him as a personal entity. So taking the Qatari jet and these kind of behaviors. So all of this does a lot to undermine the sort of unified liberal world order that had existed up until this point. What is being shaped is a new doctrine. A new doctrine that's actually an old doctrine, okay? So this is the Monroe Doctrine. This is what we're seeing come together. And the Monroe Doctrine really comes about in the early 1800s. I think it's 1817, where America's fifth president, James Monroe, is opposed directly to Europe having an influence in the Americas. So as you know, of course, throughout the 1500s, 1600s, and into the 1700s as well, European colonialism is influencing America. So Spain and Portugal take huge swathes of land in South America, in Latin America. And of course, the English come to Canada. The French also come to Canada. There's this whole wave of influence. And by 1817, James Monroe says, no, Europe, you have no say in the Americas anymore. We are the power that has control over this region. So this is the Monroe Doctrine, the idea that each major power in any given region should have a sphere of influence over which it dominates. Okay, and that delineated the idea that all of the Americas, North and South America, and Central America for that matter, were under the US's sphere of influence. So arguably, we're returning back to this idea, and arguably, Donald Trump thinks that Russia should have sort of a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe and over Ukraine, perhaps. Maybe this is too harsh, by the way. I don't think Donald Trump would say this explicitly, but this is the reading of The Economist. And China should have its sphere of influence over East Asia, which has been protected for a very long time up until this point. And again, I just want to be clear, like everything I say here, there's two sides to it. So the idea that Trump has abandoned Japan or abandoned Taiwan is not strictly true. It's hard to say what would actually happen if the conflict really started to occur, but it's kind of the trend seems to be that you, as an ally of the US, you would be getting a little bit nervous right now based on Trump's policy objectives. Okay, I'm going to answer Hardy's question in the chat. I'm sure it's going to be good, so let's answer it live. This is one of the joys of this class, is getting Q&A questions from people in the chat. So here we go. Hardy says, speaking of preserving the international world order, do you think the members of the UN shall protect and adhere to the enemy state clauses, which allows UN founders to take enforcement action against former World War II enemies like Japan if they become aggressive again? My question is, do you think that such a clause is still relevant in the contemporary geopolitics? And do you think that the founding members shall continue to preserve such clauses? I would suggest that a historical clause like that, especially regarding Japan, is unlikely to be upheld. I mean, Japan is rearming. Japan in this kind of new geopolitical tense world is rearming already. They're already sort of undermining the article of their constitution that says that they can't build up a military strike force again. So I don't think that I can't imagine the US or France or any of these other allied states directly attacking Japan as a result of this. I would imagine that that's like a part of a bygone age and that we deal with it in a more diplomatic or economic way. Obviously, there is a world where an invasion of Japan happens, but it's a very strange world indeed. It would require some very, very big shakeups to the current situation. So, well, okay, I'm going to leave Eric's question for now. We might come back to it. So let's go back here. So, Mr. Trump is essentially buying or making peace deals all around the world. He's arguably very motivated. I think it's clear based on what he said that he's quite motivated by the Nobel Peace Prize. But in the regional area, he is actually interfering in elections significantly, and he's threatening to depose Maduro in Venezuela. More and more actions have gone on. Like I think since this lecture was written, he's put a whole blockade on oil and gas ships in Venezuela. So significant interference within the region, but arguably a stepping back outside of the region and an attempt just to create peace as opposed to like hard interventionism. Now, perhaps this is already shaken up, although I think this is probably a small example, but 2 US troops were recently killed by ISIS-related forces, and Trump, I think today, went and bombed a whole bunch of ISIS-related forces. Oh, I've got echo, do I? Thank you. Interesting. Let me know in the chat whether my echo is still really bad, but is that any better? Let me know. So that's sort of the Monroe Doctrine in effect. Now, if we talk about Europe, in fact, you know what? Maybe it's this. Let me just quickly. Yeah, I see.
Okay, that should be better. In Europe, obviously, he's trying to reach a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia, but many people in his administration have even expressed some sort of sympathy with Russia's position in this war. And there is a widespread belief in regards to this that Russia is basically not a threat to the US. It's only a threat to Europe. And so this idea that we need to be protecting Europe is dropping away as well, or I say we, the US. And there's even active contempt for some in Europe. There's this feeling that Europe is basically a failed project, that it's destroying itself with massive overregulation and with wokeness, that is like over-reliance or worrying too much about social justice issues, and that they're basically causing civilizational erasure by accepting a huge number of migrants after the Syrian civil war beginning in 2011. Like that whole process of Germany letting in 1 million migrants, for instance, creating like ghettoization and not integrating them effectively has meant that they are undermining their own way of life and their own, some people would phrase it as Christian identity. This is the perspective on Europe. And there's also the view that Europe has failed to increase its defense spending sufficiently. And why would America need, or why should they front the bill to pay for European defense expenditure? Now, other people would argue, I think that basically everyone would agree that Europe probably should increase its defense expenditure as because of the recent threats, and that they haven't done enough. So there's always a balancing act to these stories, and I don't want to present anything in too one-sided a way. In Asia, if we think geopolitics, supposedly Trump has talked about the idea that they're pivoting away from Europe to confront China directly. So classic geopolitical sort of conflict space is with China. They're the rising power. There's the threat that people believe of the Thucydidean trap. This is the idea that when there are 2 emerging powers, when there's bipolarity and both powers are growing, inevitably they'll collide. It's unclear whether that's always true, but that's the fear. So they're sort of talking about shifting their attention back to China. But the US position in the region has been arguably weakened by its willingness to tariff all of its allies, like South Korea and Japan, and hurt their economies as a result. So they've demanded from Asia increased commitment, increased investment, but without necessarily promising that much in return. So what does this really tell us? It's not clear that Trump is successfully dealing with China here. So it indicates that even as the administration plays up the competition with China and is aiming to win that competition in various different fields, but particularly in AI. It has no interest in that original unipolar world with the US at the center, and basically they're willing to accept multipolarity again, where the different regions are controlled by different large powers. So we're going to see a shift probably towards that further and further. Okay, we're done with that question. Let's answer Eric's question here. Eric says the problem is the influence is all over the place. In Asia, in America, we all have got some ways of living from the Europeans. This is true. I think when we talk about these sort of geopolitical concerns, we're not really talking about cultural ways of life. We're not talking about the spread. I mean, soft power is taken through media and art and that kind of thing. But when we talk about geopolitics, I think we're talking more seriously about real physical capacity to control. We're talking about military. Yes, we're talking about soft power as well. But I think the idea that just because, someone likes eating crepes in Shanghai, like, doesn't necessarily translate to this sort of geopolitical shift. Okay. So let's go on and talk about what we should be looking for next. So as I suggested, there's going to be increased escalation by the US military in the Caribbean, as we've seen a number of attacks on these ships, which has caused some trouble for the president and his group, and potentially even a land invasion of Venezuela, which is considered quite a bad idea, because they're trying to push out Maduro, who they call basically a narco terrorist, essentially, like he controls the drug trade, which the truth of which is sort of up in the air. He's going to continue to interfere in elections in Latin America in order to protect his allies, people who he likes, like in El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, where he's been sending migrants into their jails, and in Argentina, Javier Milei, and against leftists, people who he considers on the other side of politics in places like Colombia. Now, in the Middle East, we have a different story altogether. So Trump, it has to be said, did a remarkable job to bring about the peace, the ceasefire in the Middle East, in the context of Israel and Hamas's war. But as Netanyahu is going to face really tough times, political times ahead, and weirdly, as peace becomes more prevalent in the region, as things settle down there, then there's going to be more political pressure on him, because it's considered like a massive, massive military and strategic failing that he allowed October 7th to occur in the first place. Like, why weren't those areas guarded more sufficiently? Why wasn't there, enough support to prevent all those people dying on that day? So he's going to face corruption charges, even for other things altogether. Like, there are other separate corruption charges that he faces. And with a difficult election coming up, it might be that he seeks to restart hostilities in the region. And he might try to attack Hamas again, or he might try to attack Iran again. So Mr. Trump likely will try to keep the peace in this region because he really wants that peace prize, and presumably because he just doesn't want to see people dying. That has to be said. Now, the Gulf states, they also want to keep peace and stability in the region. They are having increasing clout or support from Washington, D.C., while Israel's support is rapidly declining, especially among young Americans. So over the coming years, I guess that's more of a prediction for the longer term future, Israel's support from America is in serious doubt. The administration has also expressed interest in creating a new nuclear deal with Iran, and really would not like Israel to ruin that opportunity. We've also got things like the Saudi-Israel normalization deal. So the Abraham Accords basically created some normalization between a number of Arab states and Israel, which was a Trump policy, which was successful, and Kushner policy, it has to be said. And he would like to see that with Saudi Arabia and Israel as well. This is like an ultimate prize of creating peace in the Middle East. But that's just not going to happen, The Economist believes, without a really viable and irreversible Palestinian state, like a true state that comes to exist. But that is just politically completely infeasible in Israel today, and likely for the foreseeable future. There's just like very little chance that Israel will accept, under the current political climate and cultural climate after October 7th, any kind of legitimate fortified Palestinian state with like a military and all of these sorts of things. So Trump is going to continue to try to put pressure on Saudi Arabia to do this, but it's unlikely that he'll achieve that particular goal. In Europe, Ukraine is at risk. So they are going to continually get pushed back and pushed back further and further. Slowly, it has to be said, the front lines are really, really tied up. And just over the course of this short war, we've seen massive changes and innovations in fighting that will play a role, I think, in all future wars. Hopefully, obviously not next year, but in future wars, the idea of small, cheap drones playing a really significant role is very, very likely. And we've seen that happen. So it's worth mentioning as well that The Economist just put out an article about small drones being used, probably Russian, in European airspace. So now Europe is going through the motions of coming up with very difficult drone detection strategies. Because right now, radar does not try to find things like drones. It's designed for fast-moving, higher altitude, larger objects like planes and missiles. But small things like drones that look just like birds flying at a small pace, it's really hard to pick up. So it's expensive. It's a difficult proposition. And they're going to have to deal with that. But what that means for Ukraine, right, is that on the front line, things are in a relative deadlock. However, Russia just has so much unbelievable manpower, and this has been their strategy throughout history of just sort of throwing men at the meat grinder, as it's phrased. And thus, Ukraine will just continue to get drawn back and back, giving Vladimir Putin very little reason to stop the war. And time is just simply running out, right? Trump, his patience running thin. They had that conflict in the Oval Office. And it's just like the idea that they were going to have a peace deal on the first day was never feasible. Now it seems like a peace deal is further away than ever. We've had these like little moments of like, oh, negotiation. Nothing ever happens with regards to that. Things might get worse also in Europe as a result of pretty significant shifts to the far right. So in Britain, France, and Germany, we have really significant far right parties that are much more accepting or less hawkish on Russia, including Nigel Farage. It's a little bit hard to know from my perspective, like legitimately, whether those parties are truly pro Putin. It would be hard for me to believe that, but they're definitely not as hawkish as other players. And part of their goal, like Nigel Farage, he's the one who basically orchestrated the Brexit referendum and pushed for that really hard. Now his Reform Party is coming to power. I mean, if there was an election today, he would almost certainly win and defeat the Conservatives. And Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of Britain, basically said if that happens, then like the country's gone because he's a Putin lover. It's unclear whether that's completely true, but definitely Ukraine would be at much greater risk were that to be the case. Right now, there are basically liberal governments in all of these countries, but if that changes, things could happen. Things could happen for Ukraine that they would not like to see. Okay, let's answer a few questions in the chat. So Eric says Ukrainian first person FPVs are dangerous. One can kill a small group of people. This is true. Very dangerous. It's very true. Okay. In Asia, what's going to happen? Well, there's going to be continued economic pain as a result of these tariffs that are probably going to escalate into next year. The effect of the tariffs are going to get worse and worse. And this is ahead of the midterms. So every 2 years, there are elections for part of the Senate and for the House of Representatives. And so this could shift things very significantly because the cost of living crisis is incredibly influential. It's probably the idea that the hip pocket nerve, that's the nerve that runs down by your hip pocket where your wallet is one of the most significant reasons why people vote in any particular direction. It's arguably why Biden lost his election, is because inflation was through the roof, even though it like on paper was getting better. People felt like things were getting more difficult. Gas prices were up more than anything else, more than cultural issues, more than anything like that. Having a good economy is basically number one for winning your next election. Okay, so this will be something to keep your eye on in the future. Trump is going to really try hard to make some sort of substantive trade deal with China, which is very good for the Chinese economy and China's influence in Asia, but it is quite concerning for the sort of conflict zones in Asia, like with Taiwan and traditional US allies like South Korea and Japan. And any country that has a dispute with China, like in the South China Sea, like in Vietnam and the Philippines, all of these places, the more Trump tries to court China, the more they will feel at risk. And there's an argument that basically, as a result of that, they'll feel so at risk that they will try to create nuclear weapons programs, because that's like the only really reliable way to protect yourself is through having a nuclear weapon. And this will increase tension in the region significantly, escalating tensions with China even further. Okay, let's actually give you a poll now. I'd love for you guys to answer my questions here. I'll give you like 1 minute to try to answer these questions. So let me open my geopolitics questions right now. They're in the chat, or they're on your screen. Go ahead. You have like 45 seconds to take it. "45 seconds. So, which best describes the global order by the end of 2026? Is it a renewed US-led liberal international order? Is it a stable multipolar system with clear spheres of influence? Is it a fragmented world with weak institutions and ad hoc deals? Or is it a new Cold War centered on US-China rivalry?" The second question is, what is most likely to happen to US alliances in Europe and Asia in 2026? Are they going to strengthen as the threats increase? Are they going to formally weaken but functionally survive? Will they fracture as allies hedge towards China or autonomy? Or they collapse and are replaced by regional blocs? These are tough questions, guys. If you don't fully understand these questions, I will not hold it against you, but do your best to answer. I'll give you 10 more seconds, and then we'll see what your responses were. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, not a bad result. Let's have a look. Let's look at these answers. So, as for which will best describe the global order by the end of 2026, you are split between a few options. The highest voting percentage, 33%, went to a stable multipolar system with clear spheres of influence. I think that's close to what I suggested. And some of you think it's more a fragmented world with weak institutions and ad hoc deals. That's also plausible. Okay. And then some people think that it's going to be a rivalry with the US and China. Also not a crazy suggestion. What's most likely to happen to US alliances in Europe? You guys are really divided on this. You're not sure. I would say the alliances are going to become more fractured and more difficult. And then, I mean, who knows what's going to happen as a result of that. But I think that they are going to weaken and fracture as people aim towards autonomy or move towards China, like in Africa. Okay, guys, brilliant. Let's go on to our next topic. So we're now going to talk about the rise of AI and the impact on unemployment in 2026. And I hate to tell you guys, but this is honestly something that you should be a little bit concerned about, I would say. But if you're in grade 8 right now, the world you're going to enter as AI continues to improve and is totally different. I mean, the world you're going to enter is just so radically different to the way it is now. I think that there could be some serious shifts in employment trends that you're going to have to watch out for. And we're already seeing that begin. So perhaps as you remember, I mean, some of you are probably young enough not to remember when GPT first came out. Now, I was in my master's degree. I remember the day that GPT dropped, and I was able to find this like weird platform, like with almost no user interface design, just like a blank white thing. And I remember just like, this can't be real, like typing something in and it's shooting out a poem. And then like, ever since then, I've basically played with it. And the development that we've seen over the last few years is just radical, like so much improvement. Now it can code really sufficiently. I mean, it's still, we call it vibe coding. So the idea that it can actually like totally take over the task of a coder is not strictly true. Like even if I want to do a mail merge, it takes a while. And often if it solves one bug, it just like puts the bug that was in it before back in, and you have to go back and forth like a million times. And so if you don't know how to code, still it's difficult to code. But I think that illustrates the kind of the changing dynamics with regards to AI in the workforce pretty significantly. And you will see that. So the class of 2026 is the first cohort of 4-year college students who've gone through their entire college degree in the age of AI. And as they graduate, they are not facing a very nice job market whatsoever. So there are some predictions that basically estimate that by the end of 2026, 40% of apps used by businesses in their workflow will incorporate AI that will work alongside and instead of human workers. 40% will use them. That's up from 5% in mid 2025. Now, we don't know whether those adoption rates are accurate, but even if it's like 30%, 35%, it's a huge shift. This means that employment for new college graduates, especially in roles that are heavily exposed to AI, like software development, customer service, these have already declined by double digits since 2022. So in software development alone, which used to be like the go-to, I want to make money, I want to get rich, I'm going to go to Silicon Valley and learn how to code. The number of people who are 22 to 25 who are employed by those sort of companies has dropped 20%. So when you're thinking about your careers, there's an idea, and I'm no college counselor, you want to talk to other people about this, but there is the idea that sort of more underlying skills, obviously the ability to use AI is absolutely essential, but there's a feeling that you probably need to have much better interpersonal skills. Being the kind of person who's just able to code, but not able to have fluent, like nice interactions with other human beings is no longer enough. I think a really clear example of this in another Economist article is the idea that you would be, so for instance, AI cars, right? Self-driving cars and self-driving cars that are like Ubers, right? When someone gets stuck in one of them, they press a help button. So then you're the eye in the sky, and you might have to implement sort of code-based solutions. You might have to, there's a bunch of things you're going to have to do, but one of them is going to be to calm down these customers who are in some sort of sticky situation in one of your cars. This is just one example, but this idea that you can just rely on pure coding ability is probably getting worse and worse. Now, the reason that people are not being hired so much is not because there's a mass firing of workers, okay? So it's actually the fact that older, more experienced workers are actually getting more employment, not less. It's at the very least, it's stable. So that means that no one is hiring, but it's not like that people are getting fired. So it's not like the firms are decreasing in profitability or revenue. It's just that they don't want to hire new people because AI can basically do these menial jobs that beginner workers tend to do, like data entry becomes a lot less significant, all of these sorts of things. So that means it's really tough for people looking for their first job. Even those with work experience are feeling stress. So there are a lot of people who are the numbers of people, this is a really interesting statistic, who are voluntarily quitting their jobs in the US is a really, really low number right now. And what that tells you is that people aren't competent to find other jobs. So if you quit if you're in an economy where people are quitting jobs all the time, it's because they see lateral moves in their job, in their careers where they can go to another company and probably get a raise. Lateral moves are one of the best way to get a raise. But if no one's hiring, then no one's going to be quitting. So you can kind of get a proxy for how good the economy is, the job market is, based on how many people are willingly quitting their jobs. Okay, we have another question from Eric, but it takes us back to the previous topic. So I'm going to leave it for now. Sorry. So older workers aren't quitting. Companies are not hiring more workers, and all of this just compounds the struggle for everyone involved. Okay, we have a question up, or a hand up. Let's see if I can actually take that. I'm willing to let you ask your question out loud if you like. Let's see if I can find out how to do that. Maybe did you put your hand down already? Perhaps you did, because I can't see it up anymore. So feel free to put it in the Q&A though. This all results, or the sort of general trend of artificial intelligence is leading towards what they're calling a K-shaped economy. So they're always looking for letters to describe what goes on in the economy, that describes the trend lines. And since the end of the COVID pandemic, the letter that is dominating discourse is the K-shaped economy. So the K-shaped economy means that some people are going way up, some people are going way down, but they're dividing very quickly. The rich are getting way richer, others are getting poorer and poorer. And AI is likely a contributing factor, but also going to exacerbate this inequality. I think, again, there's an argument on both sides here as to what it will really do. And of course, it depends on what governments decide to do in the context of AI job losses. So if there is a rapid increase in intelligence of AI and a rapid job loss, I would suspect that there has to be some implementation of some sort of universal basic income to protect workers. I guess that's what I maybe hope would happen. Some sort of protection or safety net for people who lose their jobs as a result. But for the winners, you're going to see a dramatic increase in productivity and thus an increase in those people and those companies' value. For the losers, it's just like AI replaces your job. There's nothing you can do about it. So your life becomes a lot worse. But what does it exactly take to become, a winner from AI? Okay. Just getting a college education is no longer sufficient to guarantee economic security and advantages compared to anyone who's not college educated. It's just no longer sufficient, right? AI disproportionately displaces people in jobs that actually require a college education. As I just said, the tech world used to be the secure, lucrative educational path, but now it's one where people are struggling to get jobs. This is something that I think is the biggest prediction failure mode for artificial intelligence. Everyone thought, I would say if you ask anyone in 1990, or let's say 2010 or 2015 even, if we develop AI, which jobs will it take first? I think they would have all said trucking, which, I mean, it sort of is influencing that already, but yeah. But also like factory workers, manual labor, painting roads, these kind of things. But it's just not true. It turns out that those kind of skills are much harder, and that the initial wave of AI are language models, which means they manipulate language really well, which means their ability to take over jobs like teaching. I mean, I don't know how many teachers have lost their jobs so far from this, or things like proofreading, or basically white collar jobs, coding, data entry. These sorts of things are really exposed to AI in a way that we would never have expected, which is definitely interesting. This is compounded with a number of other issues in our economy that's driving this K-shaped wedge. One of them is grade inflation. So at many universities, like I know Harvard definitely has this, there's basically such an inflation of grades that it no longer is sufficient to distinguish college graduates from each other. So if you hire someone from a decent university with decent grades, that's just not an actual proxy for whether they are going to be a hardworking, good employee, which is the whole point of like trying to look at grades. So that's why more and more, and this is true advice for you young people, is you must develop other skills, other personalized skills, other skills of interaction, and you must use them to your advantage, not that they will 100% be necessary in your actual execution of your work. But to get your job, you will almost certainly need to have personal relationships with people. Now, this is because anyone can produce a really nice looking application. And everyone or a lot of people who have come out of college have a really nice application. They've got all the boxes checked, right? And not only that, but because there's hundreds of applications going out to every company all the time, what do these companies do? Of course, they get AI to read them. And that leads to credentialism, where, they're just like scanning out. If you're in the bottom 50% of universities in America, we're not even going to look at the resume. And like the AI will make decisions based on just credentials, which is like not good for real meritocracy, right? It prioritizes people who already have positions of power and who already come from wealth, thus again increasing this K-shaped wedge where the poor continue to suffer and the rich get richer. So what does that mean for you? Like, you need critical thinking ability. You do need AI literacy. You need to be able to effectively use AI. You should be practicing it all the time. You need work experience. And this is because, like, if you get into some sort of internship when you're young, there's every chance that those people remember you when you grow up and they're willing to hire you again, like in a buyback program or a rehiring program. You need to have a strong access to a network of people who can advocate on your behalf. That means that this idea that you can, join a club and just use the fact that you were in a club on your resume is like no longer really accurate, right? You need to have actual people who care about you and want you to succeed, so that when you leave school, when you go to university or even leave university, you have friends and people in higher places. Like, you've developed relationships with your professors. You go to the office hours. You actually get to know them. You go to events. You go to social events. You really have to get engaged so that you meet people, develop relations so that they can help you later in life. Because if I'm a company, right, and I put out an advertisement and I get 100 or 700, 800, 900 resumes, and then one of my friends from university comes to me and says, I did a project with that guy and I really think he's great, I'm going to hire that person, right? I'd rather that than have to read through 800 resumes that I can't trust in the first place. So this is all to say that you do need to develop these kind of social skills in a really serious way. Okay, like perhaps going to parties is no longer just frivolous. Perhaps it's like one of the most important things you can do to ensure that you end up with a decent job at the end of the day. Okay, I'll see how much everyone else agrees with that, but that's my take there. Okay, so let me see whether I've got a Q&A based on this. Let's have a quick look before we get on to our China-related content. So, business and AI, yeah. Okay, let's have a look. So by 2027, what happens to entry-level white-collar jobs? A, will they rebound as companies adapt to AI? B, they're going to stagnate but not collapse. C, they shrink permanently, especially in tech and services. Or D, will they disappear but are replaced by new AI-adjacent roles, people who are sort of working with AI? Are they going to be properly replaced? And then second question is, what best describes AI's economic impact by the end of 2026? Broad productivity gains shared across the market or society, temporary spike in inequality that later evens out, a sharply K-shaped economy with clear winners and losers, or economic disruption severe enough to force major policy reform? This is interesting. Okay, I think these questions are right up your alley. I'll give you like 7 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2. I see the answers rolling in. Let's try to get 5 more. Come on. 3, 2, 1. All right, let's end the poll and have a look. So here is what concerns you guys about AI and jobs. Number 1, what's going to happen to white-collar entry-level jobs? You think that they're going to shrink permanently. You're probably right. Second, what describes AI's economic impact? Okay, most of you chose the K-shaped curve. I said K-shaped curve about 45 times, so I'm glad you were listening. And then, yeah, I mean, that's the broad thing. I think that's probably true. Again, unless there's massive disruption that requires the government to actually step in, it is unclear how we're going to get out of this problem of just continuing down this exact trend. Okay. Let's go on to our next topic. Let's talk China. So in the last 5 years, there have been some really significant harms to China's economy. There's the collapse of one of their main real estate groups, the Evergrande Group, and a subsequent property crisis as real estate prices simply crash and people weren't even able to sell their properties. Then they had the COVID pandemic, and China took the COVID pandemic very seriously, probably rightly so to a degree, within some margin of error, where basically they did go on for a lot longer with their lockdowns with a zero COVID policy, which was always going to be extremely difficult. And then they've been battered by US tariffs. And so even though they've arguably come out on top in terms of the tariff conflict by threatening access to raw minerals and rare earth metals to the US and overcame that. Nonetheless, they have suffered as a result. When you tariff goods in the US is the biggest purchaser in the world. So when you tariff goods, it means that you're less likely to buy Chinese goods, and therefore they suffer as a result. This has led to deflation and limited consumption in China. So China's economy is basically shrinking as we speak. This is a big problem because not only is consumption decreasing, but they're also overproducing. And there is also over competition. So all of this is driving prices massively down, which really concerns the government. So we're talking about the idea that like each individual city in China really wants their firm to become the most successful. So they subsidize them, which means they become really efficient and they lower prices because they can, which means that again, it's just ruthless competition that lowers prices. And this is a problem because then they're not paying their workers as much. You basically don't have the right growth rate, the right inflation rate. You have deflation as a result, which is a problem. So this term, Neijuan, apologies for my lack of Chinese, which is described, translated into English as involution, describes this destructive rather than productive competition, right? And this has essentially made its way, this word, from the complaints of students and workers online into some official policy statements of the Communist Party and speeches by the top leaders in Beijing. So the answer to this problem of like you're producing too much and yet people aren't getting paid enough, so they're not buying those products, like, so you've literally got too much stuff, you need to look overseas. But overseas, well, one, in the US, they've just slapped on a huge number of tariffs, but other markets like the EU and just like all other markets do have the worry that if you have these incredibly cheap Chinese goods, they flood your market and they just outcompete your local companies, right? So this is like basic economics. If China produces goods and these goods from China are no longer like, you know, very breakable, like little things, they're really seriously well manufactured products. And so if you allow a huge number of cheap products, because there's so many of them, to enter your market, that people are going to buy them because they're cheaper, and then your local systems and companies are going to collapse as a result. So therefore, they put tariff barriers up against China to prevent that. And it's not just the US that's doing this, right? So there are recent reports that China's trade surplus, which is how much it exports to other countries minus how much it buys, exceeded $1 trillion for the first time, which is like has really bolstered anti-free trade people throughout Europe, especially in Europe, that is. Okay. There is an essential trend in the world that I think is going to continue, that there's going to be a reduction of economic dependence. So lots of people are worried about that. So they're trying to develop their own industries and trying to trade less with the rest of the world. This trend, I predict, will continue. So in terms of the next 5 years, these challenges will go on. There's going to be, as I just said, economic self-reliance. There's going to be more geopolitical tension with the US as Trump stays in office. And a top priority will always be to reduce exposure to the United States. And one of the key things that they're trying to do there is undermine the US technological strangleholds they have. So and this has so far worked pretty successfully. You'll remember our story from earlier in the year where an AI chip company or an AI company in China, because they weren't having access to the best possible chips from NVIDIA, they basically had to invent systems to create a more efficient AI that was able to achieve the same goals as companies like OpenAI in the US who had the best chips, but with much less compute power and much less, much fewer chips and worse chips. And they basically did that. So arguably, the restriction of technology to China, well, one, it means that we're not able to sell these goods to China, which is not good for our companies. And two, it forces them into a type of innovation that otherwise they wouldn't do, which might actually drive them further ahead than the US. So if the US cares about that, it's unclear how to protect against it. Because if you do sell them the best chips, then presumably, I mean, they may get ahead anyway. But they do want to break that. And they are being successful there because Trump has reversed that ban of the best chips. In terms of consumption, as we just discussed, one of the big issues is China's low consumption and deflation, which is just a vicious cycle going down. So there has actually been a ban in China of referring or comparing China's current situation to Japan's lost decades, which was a period of, and they also talk about the lost decade in Latin America too, where basically they had no growth and persistent deflation from a really bad bursting of an economic bubble in the 90s. So there's this idea that since the housing market collapsed, maybe there's sort of a lost decade coming. That is not allowed to be discussed. We also must expect probably more fiscal stimulus. So fiscal stimulus is a Keynesian economic idea, which is that when your economy is slowing down, you need to heat it up. And the way to heat it up is to inject capital into the market and force people to spend. So you guys are almost certainly too young to remember this. I find myself saying that more and more every year. But in 2008, there was the GFC, the global financial crisis. And if you go watch a movie like The Big Short, you're going to see a really interesting, it's relatively well explained. It might all be wrong, that entire theory of the global financial crisis being a result of the housing market. There's like definitely countervailing historical narratives on exactly what happened there, but the movie's good nonetheless. when the housing market collapsed and the entire world's economy was like built on the back of America's housing market, everything started to collapse and it was not looking good. Like lots of countries, so many people lost their jobs in this period. It was a brutal economic crash, the worst one since basically the Great Depression. And what that meant was some countries relied on stimulus. So this is just in a way to express what fiscal stimulus is. So in Australia, they gave out $800 in cash to every single family in Australia. And we had a fridge magnet that said, help the economy, buy me stuff, where the word stuff was replaced with another word. So yeah, this is fiscal stimulus. You give everyone money, you get them to spend it. This means that businesses have more money, they hire more people, and then those people have more money, and then they go out and spend their money in other businesses. Those businesses suddenly have more money, they hire more people, they expand locations, they innovate, and then they hire more people, and then those people have jobs and therefore expendable money, and you see how the cycle would go up, which is the exact opposite of what's happening here. So thus far, the government has not really wanted in China to engage in fiscal stimulus because they don't want to disincentivize work by just giving people handouts. But I think there's a prediction that they will at some point have to engage some amount of fiscal stimulus. With green energy and the climate, they will continue. They are the leading power in green energy, and their goal is to lower emissions even further. And yeah, their goal by 2030 may have already been achieved, and it's just going to continue down this path. It's amazing how quickly they're developing green energy. Now, the birth rate issue is probably the most significant, one of the most significant issues facing China. So the current birth rate is 1.1 births per woman, which is far below the 2.1 required. Sorry, a very loud notification just came through. The birth rate is like way too low to sustain an economy and to sustain a successful society. So the government is providing more and more subsidies for people to have children, but it's unclear whether this will actually work. Okay, I'm going to skip the Q&A there because we are running out of time, as I almost always do. So let's talk US. We are entering I think it's the biquincentennial. I am in Boston, Massachusetts, which is like the heart of US freedom. I live literally on the Minuteman Trail. The Minuteman Trail is the one like right there. If I put my head out the window, I could see the Minuteman Trail. That's where the Americans first fought the British out in Concord, Massachusetts, a 30-minute bike ride away. And then the British like marched back to Boston, being fired at by pot shots from people in the town that I live in. So connected to this history really significantly. And so we're entering this 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Within that, the country is deeply polarized. In fact, there was a bicentennial or a 250 celebration team set up under the previous administration, and it's now been challenged or replaced with a Trump version of that. So we'll see what actually happens. It is true that Mr. Trump is relatively unpopular. There is pretty harsh feedback coming from the business community, even if it's not public. It is seen as the case that the business community is not very happy with the idea of rebounding tariffs going back and forth. There are lots of moderates and even conservatives who were supportive of Trump, but are pretty horrified by some of the flouting of the rule of law issues. So again, all of this is disputed. I'm sort of reporting what The Economist has said here. I don't want to make too strong a public statement about whether or not there has been a full flouting of the rule of law, but certainly among liberal and left circles, this is deemed completely accurate. You've got cities across the US where ICE has been conducting deportations, are generally pretty angry about how that's been carried out, especially in places like Chicago. Now, there are Republicans in Congress that support them, but privately, some of the appointments like Pete Hegseth and RFK Jr. And Doge earlier in the year with Musk that are breaking with Trump. So Marjorie Taylor Greene, she's already broken rank with Trump completely, even as one of her closest allies. The Epstein scandal continues to haunt Trump. And in fact, just today, if you go to the New York Times right now, we will see, I haven't looked since I started the lecture, of course, but there will be updates on what was out in the most recent drop of tens of thousands of documents from the Epstein files. I will say, just on the Epstein point, that there were huge redactions. So they have the ability to redact certain things if it includes include child porn, obviously, and also if it included anything that was part of an ongoing investigation. So some entire documents were blanked out. Who knows what were in them, right? Whether they were exculpatory or challenging for the current administration is eminently plausible. We just don't know. But those files are out. There's lots of photos of Bill Clinton in hot tubs and just like really, really damaging imagery for so many famous Americans. Okay. Most importantly, as I said, is the affordability crisis, whether he can actually achieve that. He doesn't have control completely over the economy, obviously, but it does seem like tariffs, generally speaking, make that problem worse. We enter a period where we're going into some elections. There'll be a chance for the Democrats to come back in. It's worth saying that, generally speaking, the midterms are a chance for people to vote on the popularity of the president, not on the popularity of the opposing party. Right. So if people don't like what Trump's doing, then those people won't come out to vote. Democrats will come out in full force and it will be a repudiation. But it does not tell us what will happen in the actual election year of 2028. Right. It's just not obvious. And in fact, the Democratic Party is still incredibly unpopular. So, you know, what happens in the midterms will affect things. And if the Democrats, I should say, take back the House of Representatives, it will change the whole dynamic. It will change the ability for Trump just to pass laws. And it will mean that there might be some investigations that wouldn't have otherwise happened and potentially another impeachment. These things are all possible in the context of a Democrat taken House. But the overall effect of that will be potentially muted by 2028. It will depend what's happening with the economy and broader society when we get to that point. I think it's also worth mentioning here that Steve Bannon was on the Economist podcast recently. And Steve Bannon was very central to Trump's first election, and he was part of the sort of publicity side and strategic side. And he is smart, can't deny it. And he's deeply ideological in a way that I don't think Trump really is. But he's deeply ideological. And he talks very seriously about Trump getting a third term, that inevitably it's going to happen. And he basically has been a pretty good predictor of what's going to happen up to this point. So I think that the chance of a third term is also something that we will keep an eye out for. Not in 2026, of course, but in the coming years. Okay. It's unlikely they'll take the Senate because there's only 1/3 up for election. So that's unlikely. There are some key races which will sort of indicate what might happen in the presidential race. So in Texas, for instance, there's someone who's coming up who's supported by Joe Rogan, a Democrat supported by Joe Rogan, which is surprising. He's sort of a Zoran Mamdani style candidate in terms of policy platform. And if he's able to win that race in Texas, this could be an indication of what the Democrats have to do in order to win the presidential election in a few years. So we have now some predictions of business trends to close out the year. How exciting, I know, but follow along for the last little bit. If you're deciding where to invest your money, don't take this as investing advice. Definitely just leave your money in the market, as anyone sensible should. It's likely that interest rates will fall. So that means the cost of borrowing money will go down by the Federal Reserves and therefore that will attempt to boost investment and economic activity in general. Global trade will continue to falter. Electric vehicle sales will grow. There are a couple of really big sporting events. As I said, the World Cup is coming to North America, which will boost advertising revenues in the tourism industry in the US and worldwide, arguably, but definitely in the US and Canada. I'm very excited. Some of those matches will happen in Boston. There'll be a continued green transition boost, especially in China, which means that those raw materials will become more and more important, especially across Latin America. There'll be increased global defense expenditure. I would say that European defense firms are some of the biggest winners from some of these things, which leads you to argue about things like the military industrial complex, the idea that these majorly powerful, wealthy organizations, these military firms, like stimulate war or want war to happen, which is sort of an interesting thought. then there'll be continued mobilization and militarization in East Asia as a result of China becoming more powerful and the US becoming less reliable. Governments across the world are facing very high debt rates after COVID, and they're having to increase spending because of defense budgets, which means they'll have to cut things like healthcare and entitlements, which will be politically toxic for any incumbent. That means that anyone who has to do this in order to save the economy will be very, very politically unpopular as a result, causing them huge problems. It's likely that the pharmaceutical industry will continue to grow as these sort of relatively magic, I don't think we talked about these enough, but the GLP-1 weight loss drugs are basically a panacea for weight loss. There are some side effects for sure, but they're kind of unbelievable in their effects. So that will probably continue as well. Consumer demand continues to be chilled because of tariffs. Renewable energy surpasses coal manufacturing, which will be a huge thing. And AI will continue to affect every area of our society, education, economic, every area. It's just going to continue. But this relationship between investment to profit return is going to be really negative because there's going to be fear, and that will profligate the fear of an AI bubble that may burst. We have another list of 16 industries that we don't have time to go over. You can take a screenshot of this and we can give you access to this PowerPoint. You can look at it yourself. But everyone, I want to say thank you so much for joining us. And I will see you again for the start of our new year, where we go through in more depth. This was very broad. We went through a huge broad range of topics today. In a regular class, we go into more depth in individual topics and we get to go at a more steady pace. But we begin again January 2nd, where we can find out what actually happens. We can test my predictions against what could actually happen in the future. I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you so much for coming, and I will see you all on January 2nd. Ciao for now, guys. Thank you so much.